Namaste, Witchlings. Hello, hello, hello. I am your host tonight, Di the Yoga Witch, and we have got some stuff to talk about. So, before we do anything else, I want you to take one honest breath with me. Not a deep one, not a calming one, not the kind of breath you take because someone told you to relax. Just the next real breath your body is already taking. Because what we are talking about today does not require performance. It requires presence. And real presence, embodied presence, is never passive. Peace has been sold to us as something small, quiet, polite, palatable. Peace, we are told, is not rocking the boat. Peace is keeping your voice soft. It's choosing your words carefully so no one in power feels uncomfortable. Peace is staying calm while harm continues uninterrupted all around you. Peace is being reasonable even when the systems we're living inside are anything but. That version of peace ain't peace. It's compliance wearing a halo, y'all. And compliance is not neutral. Compliance always sides with whoever already has power. Many of us were taught explicitly or implicitly that peace is about being good, about being agreeable, pleasant, spiritually evolved enough not to react, especially if you are someone who was raised to smooth things over. We are, professional boat steadiers here. Especially if you were taught not to be difficult. And especially if your survival once depended on keeping the temperature low in a volatile room. Peace became a coping mechanism. Professional boat steadier. But coping is not the same thing as ethics, and coping is not the same thing as justice. This, my friends, this is where spirituality gets weaponized. We are told that if we are truly enlightened, we won't be angry. That if we are truly peaceful, we won't disrupt. That if we're truly evolved, we'll stay calm while harm continues because, well, everything happens for a reason. Bitch, that ain't wisdom. That is spiritual bypassing. Bypassing asks us to transcend the body instead of listening to it. Bypassing asks us to ignore power instead of naming it. Bypassing asks us to call numbness peace. Numbness. But numbness is not peace. It's dissociation. This is why the Sanskrit we are working with this week matters so very deeply. Because Lokah Samastah Sukhino Bhavantu does not ask us to dissociate, it asks us to care. Now, most people translate it as may all beings everywhere be happy and free. And yes, that is beautiful, but it's also demanding, if you think about it. And because all beings does not mean the ones I like. It does not mean the ones who behave. It really does not mean the ones whose suffering is convenient to acknowledge. All means all. What a thought. Lokah, the world, all realms where life unfolds. Samastah, all together without exception. All together without exception. Sukhino, well-being, ease, freedom from suffering. Bhavantu, may it be so. Not make it so. Thank you, Captain Picard. But may it be so. A blessing. not a command. And here's what's important, y'all. This mantra does not tell us how to feel. It tells us how to live. There is no instruction here to stay quiet, no instruction to submit, no instruction to accept harm as inevitable. This mantra does not ask us to be nice. It asks us to be ethical. Ethics require choice. Ethics require discernment. Ethics require us to notice where comfort is purchased at someone else's expense. And that, my friends, is where peace stops being theoretical and starts being political. Who'd have thunk peace was political, huh? Now, breathe. Because the word political makes a lot of people rather tense immediately. So let me be abundantly clear right now. This right here is not about party loyalty. It is not about slogans. It is not about purity tests. It is 100% about power. Peace that refuses to examine power is not peace. That's denial. Every system that benefits from silence will tell you that silence is peace. Every hierarchy that profits from compliance will tell you that disruption is violence. Every authority that fears accountability will tell you that calm neutrality is maturity. But history, my friends, tells us something very, very different. Every meaningful expansion of human dignity has come from people who were told they were being unpeaceful. People who were told to wait, to calm down, be reasonable, to not make waves. Peace isn't passive, because passivity doesn't preserve harmony, it preserves control. And that brings us to where we are living right this fucking minute. In a moment where power is being consolidated, not questioned. Where force is being justified with language that sounds protective, where harm is framed as a necessity, and where we are being encouraged, quietly encouraged, to mistake politeness for morality. So, if, like me, you're feeling a wee bit unsettled listening to this, if your body feels kind of tight, if there's a part of you that wants to turn this off, that ain't failure. That's your awareness waking up. Because peace isn't passive, and in the world we're inhabiting right now, peace cannot afford to be. And I'm trying not to drool on myself. All right, my loves. Now, before we go any further, I want you to check in with your body. We're not trying to calm it down. We're not trying to make it behave. We just want to notice how our body feels. Because peace that isn't passive starts with awareness, not suppression. So, in the last part of this, in the beginning, we named something uncomfortable, and that is that peace has been reframed as politeness, and politeness has been used to protect power. Who'da thunk? But now we're going to go deeper, because if peace isn't passive, then resistance is not the opposite of peace. Ooh. We've been taught to imagine resistance as chaos. It's loud, uncontrolled, dangerous. That image serves authority extremely well. Because if resistance is framed as inherently violent or destabilizing, then obedience can be rebranded as maturity and silence can be sold as a virtue. But resistance at its core is simply refusal. Refusal to accept harm as normal. Refusal to look away and refusal to outsource our conscience to people with guns, guns, money, or titles, any or all of the above. That, my friends, is not disorder, that is discernment. This is why movements like No Kings matters. Not because they're dramatic, not because they are trendy, but because they name something many, many people are trained not to question. That concentrated power is dangerous no matter who holds it. Let's try saying that word again. Authoritarianism doesn't arrive announcing itself as tyranny. It arrives as order, security, stability. It arrives through policies that sound reasonable and actions that are framed as necessary. And the most dangerous thing we can do in moments like this is confuse peace with politeness. Peace is not the absence of conflict. Peace is the refusal to let harm go unchallenged. Conflict emerges when truth collides with systems built on silence. Avoiding conflict does not make you peaceful. It makes you compliant. This is where neutrality becomes lethal. Because neutrality, that feels calm. It feels measured. It feels above the mess. But neutrality in the face of harm does not suspend violence, it simply stabilizes it. When families are separated and people are caged, and when military force is deployed under false pretenses, choosing not to engage does not preserve peace. It preserves permission. Let's talk ICE, y'all. Not in slogans, but in reality. Because the atrocities being committed by ICE are not abstract. They are not theoretical. They are documented. How many of us watched ICE fire non-lethal rounds at a priest? We are talking about people. People. Human beings, flesh and blood, disappearing into detention centers with no clear timelines. About children separated from parents and then lost in bureaucratic systems. About people denied medical care until it's too fucking late. And about deaths that are treated as paperwork errors instead of human loss. ICE does not operate as a neutral enforcement body. It is currently operating as a system of terror. Fear is the point. When people know that showing up to a courthouse could mean deportation, they stop reporting abuse. They stop seeking help. And then they disappear into the shadows. That, my friends, is not safety. That is social fucking control. Opposing ICE is not radical extremism. It is a baseline ethical response to state-sanctioned cruelty. But here's where peace has to go even further. Because ICE does not exist in isolation. Anyway, it is one expression of a much larger system that uses narratives to justify harm. This brings us to what is happening right now on the global stage. And this is where peace absolutely cannot be passive. Let's talk about Venezuela. Ooh, we're getting into it tonight. Recently, the current Secretary of Defense ordered U.S. naval ships into waters off the Venezuelan coast, publicly justifying the move as part of a drug trafficking crackdown. That was the claim. Right? But here's what peace demands we absolutely notice. The primary drug trafficking routes fueling the U.S. crisis, the primary routes fueling the U.S. crisis do not originate in Venezuela, do not go through Venezuela. They have nothing to do with Venezuela, and that is long established data. Venezuela has abso-fucking-lutely nothing to do with our drug crisis. So, when military assets are deployed under a justification that does not match reality, peace requires us to slow the fuck down and ask some better questions. Power does not move ships without motive, and history shows us that drug interdiction is a placeholder, right? Language designed to soften the public to intimidation, escalation, or intervention that serves geopolitical and economic interests. Peace is not passive when force is justified by misrepresentation, because silence in that moment does not preserve calm. It preserves consent. Now let's talk about Nigeria. And this one is especially important. Because, my friends, my loves, my witchlings, on Christmas Day, military action was ordered against Nigeria, justified publicly by claims that Christians were being persecuted and that ISIS-related threats required intervention. That framing is doing some enormous amounts of work because it collapses a deeply complex reality into a simple moral story designed to make violence feel righteous. Nigeria is a nation shaped by colonial borders, resource extraction, and decades of destabilization. Yes, extremist violence exists. Yes, people are suffering. But using religious persecution as a blanket justification for military force is not protection. It's fucking propaganda. Peace is not passive when religion is used to sanctify bombs. Bombing for peace is like fucking for virginity. Let me be clear. Let me be very fucking crystal clear. Protecting people from violence is not the same fucking thing as launching military strikes. And claiming moral high ground does not absolve harm. Nigerian civilians, they did not wake up on Christmas morning asking for foreign bombs. They did not ask to be reduced to a talking point in someone else's political narrative. This is a fucking pattern, y'all. Drugs, terrorism, religious protection, national security. These words are recycled over and over and over again, and every fucking time the public is told, this is necessary, this is for safety, this is about peace. No, it's not. It's about fucking money. Peace isn't passive when those words are used to bypass accountability. Now, here's where a lot of people shut the fuck down. Because this feels seriously overwhelming. It feels global. It feels distant and like something we can't touch. And that feeling, my friends, is by design. Because disempowerment is one of the most effective tools of control. If people believe they can't affect anything, well, they stop trying. Peace isn't passive because disengagement is not neutral. Disengagement is surrender. Might as well, show them your belly, y'all. So, what does resistance look like here? Not violence, not chaos, not savior fantasies, pressure. We resist narratives. We question official explanations instead of swallowing them whole. We support investigative journalism. We refuse fear-based and religiously framed war rhetoric. We ask representatives to justify military actions repeatedly. We resist economically. Boycotts work. War is profitable. So, we follow the money. which contractors are being paid, which corporations are benefiting from this escalation, and who is insulated from security. Then we apply pressure there. We resist collectively. Not just ICE, not just no kings, not just one protest or one boycott and all of that shit. No, peace isn't passive because resistance must be sustained. It is not episodic. It is consistent, sustained behavior. And we resist with care. Because the goal is not to burn bright and then disappear. The goal is to remain present long enough to matter. You have to be the burr under the saddle long enough to make the bull kick. And this is where peace shows its teeth. Not as aggression, but more as refusal. Refusal to accept the lies, to normalize cruelty, and to let urgency replace conscience. Peace as resistance says, I see what is happening and I am not looking away. Now, if this feels heavy, that's because it is. And we are very much not meant to carry it alone, which is where we go next. We will be talking about nervous systems, burnout, and why exhaustion is a political tool, and about how regulation becomes refusal. Stay with me here. Peace isn't passive, but it is patient. Let's see, check in with the chat. I see a Will, I see an Andrea, I see Hazel. What are you trying to write, babe? Oh, that's interesting. Oh, interesting. Automod is catching the man behind the curtain. He has a good point. We went after Nigeria because Nigerian ISIS is, persecuting Christians. So why aren't we doing the same thing to Russia, who is doing something similar to Ukrainians? Oh, yeah. Because they're not brown and Muslim. Hi, Hazel. How are you doing? I did. Okay, we are going to get into this even more. Prepare to listen to me bitch and yell at y'all. I will try to keep my voice down. Now, before we move into the body, before we talk about regulation and care, there is another layer that we need to name yet. Because peace isn't framed as passive by accident. Oh, wow. Sorry. There is a reason we are taught over and over and over and over that real peace is quiet, that it's private, that it's personal, that it is something you feel inside yourself and never something you demand in the world. That framing serves someone. Peace becomes dangerous to power the moment it stops being individual and starts becoming collective. Think about how often peace is described to us as an internal state, inner peace. Calm down. Don't get emotional. Breathe through it. Let it go. Thank you, Idina Menzel and Disney. Those tools can be helpful, truly, but only when they are not being used to silence response. Because when peace is reduced to a personal mood, systems are let off the fucking hook. If you're upset, it's your nervous system. If you're angry, it's your shadow self. If you're exhausted, well, you just need better self-care. And suddenly nothing is political anymore. It's all on us. This is one of the most effective tricks power plays. It privatizes pain. When harm is framed as something you're supposed to cope with internally rather than something we're supposed to address collectively, peace becomes a containment strategy. That's when peace stops being about justice and starts being about control. Now, look at how often marginalized people are told to be peaceful, only when they are demanding change. Be peaceful rarely means be ethical. It usually means sit down, shut up, and be quiet. And then notice who is never asked to be peaceful. Corporations. Military forces, even when we go on peacekeeping missions. That one never made sense. Governments consolidating power. They're described as decisive, necessary, protective. Violence done by authority is framed as order. Resistance to violence is framed as disruption. That inversion is not accidental. This is why peace that isn't passive is so threatening, because it refuses the script. It won't follow the pre-programmed ideas. Peace that isn't passive says, I will not confuse calmness with morality. I will not confuse obedience with goodness. I will not confuse silence with safety. Peace that isn't passive understands that comfort and justice are just not the same thing. Let's talk about language for a minute after I take this off, because I think it's making me itch. All right. Let's talk about language for a second. Words like stability, security, order, and protection. These words sound peaceful, but peace asks us to interrogate them. Stability for whom? Security for whom? Order at whose expense? Protection from what and for whom? When military actions are framed as keeping the peace, peacekeeping missions, we need to ask what peace and whose bodies are being sacrificed to maintain it. Peace isn't passive when it asks better questions. And this, my friends, is also why we need to talk about moral exhaustion. Because people don't disengage because they stop caring. We disengage because caring without agency hurts, and it hurts too much. When people are bombarded with crisis after crisis and atrocity after atrocity and given absolutely no meaningful pathways for response, the nervous system just shuts down. It's not apathy. That is our bodies protecting themselves. Peace isn't passive when it acknowledges that. Peace doesn't shame people for being tired. It asks, how do we restore capacity so people can re-engage? And this is why rage alone cannot sustain a movement. Rage is a spark, yes, but it burns hot and fast. Peace that isn't passive knows how to hold anger without letting it consume the body. Anger, when regulated, is information. It tells us where boundaries have been crossed, where harm is happening, and it tells us what actually matters. Because uncontained anger becomes destructive, first to the body, then to the community. So, peace doesn't suppress anger, peace houses it. And this is one of the hardest teachings for people who care deeply. You don't need to feel everything at full volume all the time to be morally awake. You don't have to. Constant emotional flooding does not make you more ethical. It makes you less effective because you become so overwhelmed. Peace that isn't passive understands pacing, rhythm, and that sustainable resistance looks boring compared to viral outrage. And that's okay. That's fine and dandy. It's perfectly okay. So, Let's also name something else that rarely gets spoken aloud. There are people who benefit when movements remain chaotic. Disorganized resistance is so easy to dismiss. Burned out activists are easy to wait out. And infighting is a gift to power. Peace that isn't passive prioritizes coherence. Not sameness, not perfection. Alignment. Alignment around shared values, non-harm, and around sustainability. That alignment does not come from everyone doing the same thing, though. It comes from everyone knowing why they are doing what they're doing. And this is where peace starts to look strategic. And strategy is not the enemy of ethics. Strategy is how ethics survive contact with reality. Okay, now, before we move into the body and before we talk about regulation, I need to say this clearly. If you have ever felt guilty for not being angry enough or loud enough or visible enough, that guilt did not come from justice. It came from our urgency culture. Peace isn't passive, but it does not demand constant activation. It demands integrity in speech, action, and rest. Yes, it actually demands that we rest. And that brings us back to our bodies. Because bodies are where movements either endure or collapse, and that's where we go next. When people say, what can we even do? Well, there's a moment that comes for almost everyone who is paying attention. A moment where the weight of what's happening... Blurp? Oh, sorry. Backing up. There is a moment that comes for almost everyone who is paying attention here. A moment where the weight of what's happening locally, nationally, globally feels so heavy that the question slips out, sometimes aloud and sometimes internally. What can we even do? That question is not apathy, it's grief. It's what happens when people care deeply and feel shut out of meaningful influence. And peace isn't passive when it comes to that moment, because despair is one of the most effective tools of control. When people believe their actions don't matter, they stop acting. And when people believe that everything is rigged beyond repair, they just disengage. And disengagement looks a lot like peace from the outside. It's quiet, it's calm, unbothered, but it's not peace. It's resignation. Resignation is incredibly convenient for systems built on harm, because resigned people don't organize, they don't pressure, they don't disrupt the narratives. They survive quietly or burn out privately. So, when someone asks, what the can we even do? Peace doesn't shame them. Peace answers honestly. The first honest answer is this: you were never meant to do everything. I'm going to repeat that. You were never meant to do everything. One of the most corrosive myths we've absorbed is that meaningful action has to look enormous to count, right? That if you're not out on the front lines risking arrest or giving everything you have, you're not really doing anything. That belief doesn't come from justice. It comes from spectacle culture. And what is spectacle culture? Spectacle culture loves big moments, viral images, and heroic narratives. But movements don't survive on spectacle. They survive on consistency. Peace isn't passive because it understands scale. Not everything that matters is loud. Not everything that changes systems happens in the street. Some of the most consequential work happens quietly, repeatedly, and without applause. Peace asks, where does pressure accumulate? Well, Pressure accumulates when people keep calling instead of just calling once and giving up. Keep showing up instead of showing up once. Keep refusing narratives instead of letting them slide. And keep talking to each other instead of retreating into silence. Pressure accumulates when harm is named again and again and again after the news cycle has moved on. We have about a 2-week news cycle. We need to keep talking about this shit. That's why they're throwing so much at us. They're trying to overwhelm us. Pressure accumulates when harm is named after the news cycle moved on. I need to repeat that because we need to remember this. This is where peace stops being an emotion and becomes a practice. Here's another thing we need to say out loud. People are often told to focus on local change as a way of shrinking their concern, right? But local and global are not opposites, they're connected. Policies enacted in faraway lands, they land in local bodies. Military actions taken elsewhere show up as migration, trauma, and economic strain here. Peace isn't passive because it traces those connections. You don't have to understand every global conflict in detail to notice patterns, though. Patterns like force justified by fear, suffering framed as necessary, marginalized people blamed for instability, and accountability deferred indefinitely. Peace notices patterns because patterns tell us where to apply the pressure. And sometimes pressure looks like conversation. This one matters a whole lot more than people want to admit. The stories we tell each other, every day, they shape what feels possible. When harmful narratives go unchallenged in everyday spaces like kitchen tables, group chats, and break rooms, they harden and solidify. Your cousin who's spouting, violent rhetoric, he's going to keep talking about it, and eventually he's going to think that actually acting on it is okay if he doesn't get shut down, right? Peace isn't passive when it interrupts those narratives. We don't interrupt with shouting or shaming, but with clarity. Saying things like, I'm not exactly comfortable with that framing. Darling, that explanation leaves a lot out. I think there's more going on here than what they're saying. Those moments feel small, but they are not. Culture shifts before policy does. Always. And here's another hard truth, my friends. A lot of people are waiting for permission to act. They are waiting for someone to tell him, now it's serious enough. Now it's bad enough. Now you're allowed to speak. Peace isn't passive because it doesn't wait for permission from power. It waits for alignment with conscience. Now, this doesn't mean reckless action. It means responsive action. Acting in ways that are thoughtful, informed, and sustainable. Acting in ways that don't sacrifice the body for the illusion of urgency. This is also where community becomes essential, because isolated people doubt themselves. They wonder if they're overreacting, if they're wrong, or worse, if they're alone. Peace isn't passive because it brings people together so they can reality check each other, get us out of our echo chambers. Community says, you're not imagining this. You're not crazy for being upset, and you are not alone in wanting something different. That's not comfort. That's clarity. And another thing peace asks us to release is the idea that action must always feel inspiring. A lot of meaningful action is boring, repetitive, it's administrative, and oh my God, is it frustrating. It's tedious. Calling offices again, writing letters that get ignored, showing up to meetings that feel pointless. Peace isn't passive because it values endurance over adrenaline. And endurance requires regulation, which brings us back once again to the body. Because hopelessness is not just an idea, it lives in the nervous system. When people are overwhelmed, their bodies go into freeze. They scroll, they numb, they disengage. Peace isn't passive when it recognizes freeze and responds with care instead of judgment. Care looks like slowing the pace, reducing input, creating some space for processing, and offering support instead of demands. Care restores agency, and agency is what makes action possible. So, when someone asks, what the fuck can we even do? Peace answers, you can stay present, connected, honest, and resourced. Now, that may not sound dramatic, but it is how change survives long enough to take root. Peace isn't passive. It doesn't require despair, heroics, or perfection. It requires participation. And participation, sustained over time, is one of the most powerful forces there is. Sip. Oops. I'm sorry, I keep that the pop is one of my stims, and I apologize. I'm not meaning to do it into the mic. All right. Yeah. Oh, I see a mic. Oh, so that's who mentioned the Deadpool movie. I just saw the Deadpool movie get mentioned. Yes. That's funny. Yeah, it took her. The reason I was looking around and kind of jumped, he was making a really weird noise behind me and I couldn't figure out what he was doing. All right. Are we ready to continue? I think we are, almost. That works. Yes. My head. But yes, please hop over and subscribe if you are a subscriber to Die the Yoga Witch or Yoga with Darlene, whichever channel. Please hop over and check out and subscribe to Die the Yoga Witch too. It is my backup account just in case somebody decides to nuke this one. Just a thought. All right. Have to take a couple of breaks here and there to check in with the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to start screaming at the screen. Because this one kind of gets me worked up a bit. All right. Welcome back, my witchlings. Now, before we go any further, we want to pause real quick again because the conversation... Not because the conversation is too much and not because we need to soften it, but... because if peace isn't passive, then how we carry this particular conversation matters. All right, so notice your body right now. Are you tensing up? Notice your breath, your jaw. Notice if your shoulders have tried to find your earlobes. You don't need to fix anything. I just want you to notice it because awareness is where our power starts to return. One of the most effective tools of domination is not violence, it's exhaustion. Burnout culture didn't just happen. It is cultivated. Burnout culture, I'm going to say this again, didn't just happen. It is cultivated. Because tired people are so much easier to control. Overstimulated people are easier to manipulate. Overwhelmed people are easier to silence. Oh, dear Lord. That sounds like boot camp. Hui. Exhaustion, overwhelm, and overstimulation. Yeah, that's boot camp. Makes sense. So, if you're reacting constantly to breaking news, outrage cycles, and the next manufactured crisis, you really don't have time to think, you do not have time to connect, you don't have time to organize, and you sure as fuck don't have time to imagine any alternatives, do ya? Urgency hijacks discernment, and systems built on harm depend on urgency. This is why nervous system regulation is not a luxury. It is not self-help. It is not aesthetic wellness. It is not spiritual escapism. It's political refusal. When you regulate your nervous system in a culture addicted to crisis, you are refusing to let fear dictate your choices. When you pause instead of reacting, you are refusing to be predictable. When you rest without guilt, you are refusing the lie that your worth is measured by constant output. That refusal matters. And this right here is one of the biggest reasons I co-founded the Civic Care Collective. Because political burnout is not an individual weakness, it is a structural outcome. People are expected to stay informed, stay outraged, stay mobilized, without support, without rest, and without space to process grief or fear. Grief and or fear. And then, when they collapse, the narrative becomes, they couldn't hack it. That's not the truth, though. The truth is that no nervous system is meant to live in perpetual crisis without care. The Civic Care Collective exists. Okay. The Civic Care Collective. It exists to name something that should be obvious but rarely ever is. Care is infrastructure. It's not decoration. It's not a side project. And it is sure as the fuck not something we earn after doing the real work. Care is what makes real work possible, my friends. You cannot build justice on broken bodies. You cannot sustain resistance through constant depletion. You cannot create peace through systems that disregard human limits. And this is where peace becomes active in a very practical way. Because peace asks, how do we stay in this for the long haul? Because there is a difference between intensity and endurance. Intensity burns hot and fast. Endurance lasts. Why is my brain saying intensity is a pine wood burn and endurance is Madrona? Makes sense to my brain. Movements that rely on intensity alone, they eat their people alive. People disappear, they turn on each other, they become brittle, cynical, or numb. And eventually the movement just collapses. Not because the cause was wrong, but because the bodies carrying it were not supported. They were never supported. Peace isn't passive, but it is paced. And this is also where we need to talk about the savior narrative. Because savior narratives sound noble. They say, if I don't do everything, nothing's going to change. If I rest, people will suffer. If I slow down, I'm complicit. Yeah, no. Savior narratives are deeply individualistic. They center one body, one voice, one heroic arc, instead of collective care and shared responsibility. And guess what? They burn people out. Peace doesn't ask you to carry the whole world on your nervous system. Dudes, that is not courage. That is collapse waiting to happen. A regulated body can do things a dysregulated one cannot, okay? A regulated body can hear hard truths without shutting down. We can hold anger without weaponizing it, set boundaries without cruelty, and stay present through discomfort. It allows us to act strategically instead of reactively. That's not passivity. My dears, my darlings, my witchlings, that's capacity. Let's make this concrete. Very concrete here, y'all. Think about the last time you were overwhelmed by the news. We had another attack, another policy, another fucking presidential order, another justification. Justification? Wow, die. Another justification for violence. Executive order. There we go. Notice what happened in your body as you think about this. Did your breath shorten? Did your chest kind of tighten up? Did your mind start screaming towards worst case scenarios? Darlings, that response is human. But when we live there in that space, when our baseline becomes panic or despair, we lose access to nuance, empathy, and creativity. Peace. Peace as a lived practice asks a different question. How do I metabolize this information without letting it destroy my ability to respond? That there's a nervous system question. This is why practices like breath awareness, movement, rhythm, and rest are not escapes. They are recalibrations. They return us to ourselves so we can return to the work clearer and steadier. And here's something that really doesn't get said often enough. Regulated people are harder to control. If dysregulated people are easier to manipulate, logic tracks that regulated people are going to be a little harder to control. Fear makes people predictable. Calm makes people discerning. And they don't want us to be discerning. When you are not hijacked by panic, you can ask better questions. You can notice the little inconsistencies. You can resist manipulation, and you can refuse narratives designed to scare you into obedience. Who'da thunk? That is why care threatens systems built on fear. Peace that is embodied can hold grief without drowning in it, anger without letting it become cruelty, and it can hold hope without illusion. And that kind of peace doesn't look dramatic. It looks steady. So, my friends, if you have ever felt guilty for resting, stepping back, or for choosing regulation over reaction, I want y'all to hear this very, very clearly. That choice was not abandonment. It was alignment. Peace isn't passive. It is Peace isn't passive. It is disciplined, protective, and deeply rational. And it prepares us for what comes next. Because regulation is not the end of the work. It is what allows us to continue. And in our next part, we are going to bring everything together. We're going to talk about what active peace actually looks like in day-to-day life. Not in theory, not in slogans, but in choices, boundaries, community, and sustained resistance. For now, check in one more time. Notice your breath. Notice the support beneath you. You are allowed to stay. You are allowed to last. Peace needs you regulated. Yes. Okay, so Mike is saying if we're aware of our surroundings, we realize when politics doesn't pass the sniff test. Very true. And then he makes the comment that he smells less fish when he lived on the docks. I think you'd smell less fish in a tuna factory, my friend. Tuna cannery. Cannery. That's true, too. That is true. As I'm being reminded, as acclamation, you don't smell the litter box when you live in the house with it. Oh, that was a scent memory I didn't need to relive. I know you did, they didn't. In case you I cannot laugh. Give me a second, y'all. Right after I said you don't smell the litter box when you live in the house with it, somebody decided to meow at me. His timing, as ever, was perfect. Come here. Oh my god. You're a good cat. I know. We're back. Smell-o-vision. Yes. Alright, now that we've had a good little... Alright, now that we've had our little giggle break... Oh, here comes the Took monster back, too. All right, back to the show. Welcome back, my witchlings. If you're still here, and I do mean really here, I want to start by honoring that, because staying present for this particular conversation is already an act of resistance. We've talked about peace as refusal, as resistance, and as regulation. Now we arrive at the question that always comes next, the one that hums underneath everything we've been naming. What do we actually do? That's a good question. Because peace isn't passive, but it also isn't frantic. And one of the biggest traps we fall into is believing that if we don't do everything, we're doing nothing. And that belief right there, my friends, oh boy, that belief right there burns people out. It fractures movements, and it quietly serves the very systems we're trying to oppose. So let's be crystal clear right here, y'all. Peace does not require heroics. It requires participation. Participation looks different depending on who you are, what you have access to, and what your body and life can sustainably hold. And peace asks us to respect that diversity instead of ranking each other's contributions. Because movements that shame people for not doing enough eventually become indistinguishable from the systems they oppose. I was actually watching a video on this just the other day. The Target boycott that many of us are participating in because of Target rolling back their DEI policies. If Target is legitimately the only store in like a 50-mile area radius that somebody has access to buy things like, pads, tampons, or other necessities, diapers, then they're going to use Target. We can't expect them not to. And shaming them for using Target doesn't do anybody any good, and it really looks badly on the movement, because you're effectively, by shaming them for using Target, telling them that they're not worthy, You're telling them that they're awful, horrible people because they don't have the ability to drive 2 hours out of their way to go find another place to shop, because really the only other convenient place to shop is Amazon. We don't want to shop Amazon either, so pick your poison. This is definitely a pick your battles moment. Peace isn't passive, but it is relational, which means what we do next has to be rooted in connection, not comparison. Let's talk about protest first, because protest matters. Marches matter. Rallies matter. Showing up in public, being visible, and in other visible ways matters. But peace isn't passive, and it isn't episodic either. Because one march does not dismantle a system. One rally does not stop a war. And if protest becomes the only tool we know how to use, we exhaust ourselves chasing moments instead of building pressure. So, active peace asks us to expand our imagination. Anyway, protest is not just bodies in the street. Protest is refusal. Refusal to normalize cruelty, repeat dehumanizing language, and refusal to let lies go unchallenged. Protest can look like calling your representatives repeatedly, not just once. Demanding explanations for military actions, not just accepting the press releases. Supporting journalists who investigate instead of echo. Showing up to court dates as witnesses. Donating to legal defense and mutual aid funds if you have the available finances. Organizing teach-ins instead of doom scrolling. None of this is glamorous. That's why it works. Peace isn't passive. It's persistent. Now let's talk about something else that makes people really, really, really uncomfortable. Refusal culture. Refusal culture is the quiet backbone of every meaningful change. It's what happens when people collectively decide, we're not doing this anymore. Not violently, not recklessly, but firmly. The minor hesitation is I'm hearing, we're not gonna take it. No, we ain't gonna take it. That is exactly what we're talking about here. Refusal culture looks like refusing to accept national security as a blanket excuse for harm. Refusing to let religious language justify violence. Refusal to treat civilian deaths as collateral damage. Refusing to let exhaustion become the price of caring. Yeah, that song really does apply, doesn't it? Refusal culture is powerful because it withdraws consent. And systems built on domination cannot survive without consent. This here is also where economic pressure matters, because violence is rarely just ideological. It is profitable. War has contractors. Detention has shareholders. Extractions has beneficiaries, and peace isn't passive when it follows the money, honey. We ask, who is being paid, who is being protected, who is being insulated from consequence, and then we apply pressure right there through boycotts, divestment, exposure, and sustained attention. Not once, continuously. This is where people typically ask, but what difference does it really make? And here's your honest answer. Change rarely comes from one dramatic moment. It comes from accumulation. Small pressures applied consistently reshape what is possible. Peace isn't passive. It's cumulative. And now, my friends, let's talk about community. Because absolutely none of this works in isolation. And pretending otherwise is another way we get burned out and discouraged. Now, community doesn't just mean agreement. It means shared responsibility. It means being able to say, hi, I need to rest. Can you hold the line for a little bit? It means, I don't know, can you help me learn? And I am furious. Can you help me stay grounded? This is where collective care stops being a nice idea and becomes strategy. And this, my loves, this is why work like the Civic Care Collective exists, because movements without care recreate harm internally, and movements with care last long enough to matter. Care is not the opposite of resistance, my friends. Care is what keeps resistance from becoming cruelty. Living the blessing, Lokah Samastah Sukhino Bhavantu, means recognizing that how we treat each other inside movements matters just as much as what we oppose outside them. Peace isn't passive, and it doesn't excuse harm just because the cause is good. Now let's also talk about limits, because limits are not failures. They're how we remain human. You will not attend every protest. You will not read every article. You will not respond to every crisis. That does not make you complicit. It makes you embodied. Peace does not ask you to destroy yourself in order to prove your sincerity. Peace asks you to stay present long enough to reduce harm where you actually are. And this is where hope comes back into the conversation. And we need to be honest about hope, because hope gets weaponized too. We are often told to stay hopeful in ways that really mean don't disrupt, don't grieve, don't question, don't make things uncomfortable, don't rock the boat. That, my loves, is not hope. That's sedation. Real hope is sober. Real hope does not deny harm. It doesn't rush grief, and it doesn't promise easy endings. Hope says, I see how bad this is, and hi, I'm still here. That kind of hope requires regulation. It requires community. It requires pacing. And it requires peace that isn't passive. So, if you're sitting with the question, what more can I be doing? Here's the most honest answer I can give you. Do what keeps you in the work and not what empties you out. Find your lane and respect other people's lanes. Support instead of compete. Rest instead of disappear. And speak when silence causes harm. Pause when urgency clouds discernment. Peace spreads through continuity, not intensity. And now, before we close, I want to invite you into one final reflection. It's not something to resolve or solve. It's not something to solve or something to optimize. It's just a question to sit with. Where can I practice peace today without abandoning myself or others? Now, let whatever answer comes be enough. As we end this episode, my friends, I want to leave you with this reminder. You do not need to be perfect to live the blessing. You do not, let's try that again. I want to leave you with this reminder. You do not need to be perfect to live the blessing. You need to be present, honest, and willing. That's it. Peace isn't passive. It breathes. It resists. It rests. It returns. There is one more piece we need to talk about before we close, because peace isn't passive and it also isn't fleeting. One of the quiet ways people disengage is by telling themselves that paying attention is optional, that staying informed is a choice, and that stepping back is the same thing as self-preservation. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's something else. Sometimes it's withdrawal dressed up as wisdom. Peace isn't passive when it comes to witnessing, because witnessing is not neutral. To witness is to say, I see what is happening, I am not looking away, and I am not pretending this is normal. Because this shit ain't normal. And that matters more than we've been taught to believe. Because systems built on harm depend on invisibility. They depend on people not knowing, or knowing but not staying long enough to care. Staying with the truth is uncomfortable. It asks us to tolerate grief without immediately resolving it. It asks us to sit with anger without discharging it into the nearest target. It asks us to hold complexity without using it as an excuse to disengage. Peace isn't passive because it stays. Now, this doesn't mean consuming every headline. It doesn't mean living in a constant state of alert. It means refusing the lie that looking away is the same as being healthy. There is a difference, a huge fucking difference between rest and avoidance. Rest restores capacity and avoidance erodes conscience. Peace begs us to learn that difference. This one is especially important when harm becomes routine, when bombings become developments and deportations become policy, when civilian deaths are just another statistic. Normalization is one of the most powerful tools of violence because once something is normal, it no longer feels urgent. Peace isn't passive when it resists normalization. When it says, this is not normal, this is not acceptable, and this is not something I am just going to quietly absorb. Fuck that. That resistance doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like remembering. Remembering names. Remembering places. Remembering that real people live inside the headlines. This is why I'm going to mention the BLM movement. This is why the Black Lives Matter movement wants us to say their names. Because as soon as we forget the people that we're fighting for, we lose the point. Memory is political. Forgetting is convenient. Peace that isn't passive refuses convenient forgetting. And this is also where grief comes in, because grief is not the opposite of peace. Grief is evidence of connection. A culture that tells you to stay positive in the face of suffering is not asking you to be peaceful, it's asking you to be numb. Peace can hold grief. It doesn't rush it. It doesn't tidy it up. And it sure as fuck doesn't demand that it be productive. Fuck that. Grief says this mattered. This still matters. And these lives were not expendable. That recognition right there is an act of resistance. And also, it's an act of love. And this is why peace that isn't passive doesn't require you to be cheerful. It requires you to be honest. Honest about what hurts, what angers you, what you don't know, and most of all, honest about your limits. Honesty keeps movements human. Now, before we close, I want to say this clearly. If you're still listening, if you are still caring, if you are still asking what more is possible, you are not failing. The goal was never to feel good about the world. The goal was to stay connected to it. Peace isn't passive. It stays, remembers, witnesses, and it refuses to let harm become background noise. And when peace lives this way, quiet, steady, and present, it becomes something powerful. Not because it dominates, but because it endures. May all beings be happy and free. May peace move through you. May peace move through you without costing you your humanity. May your presence be part of what makes the world more livable. Lokah Samastah Sukhino Bhavantu. Namaste, my witchlings.